everyone, and you're very welcome to the 10th edition of the ISLA Festival, the Irish, Spanish and Latin American Festival in Ireland, organised by Instituto Cervantes in association with the Latin American embassies in Ireland and supported by Dublin UNESCO City of Literature. My name is Catherine Dunne. I'm a writer of fiction and non-fiction, and joining me today in this conversation is Patrick Freyne. So before Patrick and I begin our chat, I'm just going to give you a brief introduction to Patrick and his work. Patrick Freyne is a well-known Irish journalist who, by his own admission, spent most of his 20s trying to be a rock star until he turned to the much more stable and secure world of journalism. Patrick writes for the Irish Times, and his in-depth, insightful, humorous, and always compassionate interviews and features are among my reading delights. He tackles a wide range of issues, from drug addiction to how to talk to anti-vaxxers, to deconstructing in a hilarious fashion the latest TV or Netflix offerings. His first book, and I emphasize first because I'm already looking forward to a second, is called Okay, Let's Do Your Stupid Idea, a collection of essays that manages to be funny, poignant, and deeply human. So, Patrick, perhaps you'd now give us a brief flavour of Okay, Let's Do Your Stupid Idea.
Thanks, Catherine. I'll read from the very start of the book. This is from the first essay. It's an essay called It's the Military Life for Me. When I was 12 years old, my army man father brought me on what I took to be a bonding father-son camping trip in a stretch of the Wicklow Mountains. My mother drove us to the edge of civilization, where we got out of the car and walked up a dirt track. Along the way, my father cut and carved 2 walking sticks out of blackthorn branches, and after a few hours of walking, we camped in the shade of a wood by what I can only describe as a babbling brook, because it was a brook and it babbled. It was idyllic, really. We ate army rations of sausages and beans from little foil tins heated over a campfire, and from time to time I spoke coordinates that my father called out to me into a little walkie-talkie. Around 20 years later, the family was waxing nostalgic about this over after-dinner drinks. Why did we have a walkie-talkie? I asked. It was a strange part of the memory that never quite made sense. Well, said my father, we needed it to keep in touch with the rest of the men. The rest of the men, I said. I don't understand. You see, there were rumours of an IRA training camp in the mountains, and the Rangers had been asked to investigate, said my father. The Rangers, by the way, were a crack commando squad, and my dad was, at this time, their commanding officer. Right, I said. So I figured the terrorists would have their eyes peeled for guards and soldiers. Sure. But if they saw a man and his child, they'd think it was just a father and son on a camping trip. I thought we were a father and son on a camping trip. Oh no, said my father. That was just a cover. A cover? Well, you were reading my son, admitted my father. I'm glad to hear it, I said. But we weren't purely on a father and son camping trip, he said. No, I said, a little bitterly. Apparently we were tracking terrorists. My father nodded happily. Was it not a bit dangerous? Asked my wife. What if you'd actually run into trouble? Oh, it was fine, said my father. I was armed. You had a gun, I said. Again, my father nodded happily, in a shoulder holster. What type of gun? Asked my wife, whose hippie parents wouldn't let her play with toy guns, and who will certainly, as a consequence, end up killing someone with a gun. I didn't wait for an answer. I could have been killed, I cried. But nothing happened, said my wife, and looking at my father, she added, right? Nothing happened, said my father, but he had a mysterious look on his face that led me to picture him drowning an IRA man in the brook as a 12-year-old me slept soundly nearby. I wouldn't put it past him.
Thank you, Patrick. Thanks very much. I had a conversation with the Spanish writer David Trueba recently, and he's also written a memoir about his adolescence and his family. And one of the things we were discussing, and it certainly comes across in your work as well, you don't at all bow to the current fad of misery memoir.
No, I feel relatively privileged in general. Um, I've always loved funny writing and funny writers. And I always thought I'd write a book of kind of funny essays. So I loved people like Clive James and PG O'Rourke and Nora Ephron, although she kind of does a much wider thing, and David Sedaris.
Yeah.
And so in the olden days when I pictured doing a kind of book of essays, it was kind of totally in that vein. And then in recent years, I've been very influenced by, like, there's been a great wave of primarily female essayists here, like Sinead Leeson and Emily Pine and my colleague Rosita Boland, and they're just amazing, and they went kind of deeper.
Yeah.
So when I eventually came around to doing this book, I wanted to do something that mixed a bit of both, you know? And humor is like kind of fundamental to kind of how I see the world. Like, my favorite things have some element of humor in them, even if they're kind of even if, you know, even my favorite dramas will have funny bits, or my favorite novels, if they're a serious novel, there's still a bit of an irony in the tone. And I think a lot of Irish people actually go through life like that, where everything is filtered through some sort of layer of humor.
Joke, yeah.
So it was always destined to be in what I do, you know.
David Thraver the other day said that for him, humor is what he called an act of revenge against sadness. Would you agree with that?
That's a great way of putting it, actually. I think that's true. Like, I think I've thought a lot about humor in recent years, particularly when I was writing this essay collection, and often in my journalism. Like, there's a kind of line where you kind of go, is a joke appropriate here? You know, like the fact that, and often a joke is appropriate, and then sometimes it's not, and you kind of have to remove it. And sometimes I don't know if you've ever come across the comedian Hannah Gadsby.
I haven't. No.
She's got a great comedy show that's available on Netflix called Nanette. Okay. And it's actually brilliant because she starts with this very, very funny comedy show. And as she goes on, she starts to deconstruct her own jokes and kind of explains how the joke is a little bit of a betrayal of the reality. You know, that was actually a very upsetting event in her life that she's turned into a joke. And it was kind of about the limits of humor, you know. So when I was writing these essays, like, part of the editing process was sometimes it was about removing jokes, you know, because my tendency is to have my tendency in real life is to have a drum roll at the end of everything, you know, and my very good editor, Brendan Barrington, would occasionally point out, you know, this is a very serious section here. You made some really good observations. And that is a funny joke at the end, but it kind of undermines what came before.
Sure, it might go somewhere else, yeah.
Yeah, so it can go somewhere else. So I've thought a lot about, like, how we use humor, because it can be a really good way of filtering reality in a positive way, and a great way of, I've found when I'm doing kind of TV criticism, a really good metaphorical joke can be a great way of understanding something. You know, it's a great way of breaking stuff down. But emotionally, I think Irish people in particular, but actually it's probably international, I just know more Irish people, there's a tendency to use jokes as a way of avoiding the emotion. So I've got to constantly figure out which I'm doing.
Or indeed, sometimes I think even just, you know, to live in a situation with black humour, which is very prevalent, I think, in the north of Ireland. And there's a lovely black take, which you laugh and then you're almost embarrassed because you've laughed, but yet it releases some kind of tension. It's like a pressure cooker valve that lets off the steam.
Yeah.
But you managed to move effortlessly between, it was Mark O'Connell interviewing you some time ago, and he said you manage consistently funny reviews of television and Netflix, which you do, and I enjoy them enormously, but that you're also an interviewer of rare sensitivity and depth. So you have these two sides to certainly to your writing style, and it's certainly the sensitivity and the depth that comes out in the interviews that you do around social issues in Ireland. And I think you mentioned recently that the older you become, not that you're old, but the older you become, that the more leftward leaning you become, because you see what you've called kind of wasted potential, whether that's through drug addiction or lack of opportunities or homelessness or whatever. Can you tell us a little bit about what that experience is like of actually meeting people where they are and basically writing their lives?
So I've realized it's a great privilege, and the more I do it, the more I want to keep doing it. Like, there's something amazing about, I think when I was younger and I was being a show off in rock and roll bands and things, I kind of wanted to be the star of everything. And the more journalism I did, the more I realized that, there's a place for yourself in your writing, and it's there in my essays and it's there in my kind of TV columns. But that the great joy of doing kind of reportage, like it could be going to, like, say recently I spent some time with some teenage Roma musicians in Longford, or I spent some time I went around with the Simon community and talked to some homeless people about what COVID had and the pandemic had been like for them. The best thing you can do in those circumstances is just be curious and step as far out of the picture as you can, because there's so many. I think I had this notion when I was younger that all interesting things were happening in other countries or somewhere else. And the more you talk to people, the more you realize there are incredible stories, personal tragedies and triumphs, and all around us. In any town in Ireland or in any townland or city in any country, really, there's an awful lot of amazing kind of emotional experiences. And when I talk to people now, I kind of discovered, as I wrote a little bit about interviewing in my book, but I kind of discovered that the more you take yourself out of the picture and the more you just you do all your research and then you kind of follow your own natural curiosity. And people are amazing. People, like, you're a fiction writer and I'm trying to be a fiction writer, but the more I interview people, the more I kind of balk at my own awful short stories, because I kind of look at what amazing things just anyone on the street can say. Like, you can talk to someone and they give you a quote that you would never invent in a million years, that is totally them and is totally a product of their life and their experience. And it's just this kind of, like, I guess one of the joys of interviewing people is you get this really strong sense of everyone's really unique individuality and unique experience, and how they deal with a situation in a completely different way to, say, someone else who might be in the same situation. And that's something I love experiencing when I'm talking to people, but I also really want to bring out in the writing, that there's no stereotypes. There's nobody in the world who is like a stock character. Everybody is fascinating and unique, no matter what their problems or the good or bad things in their life. They've got their own perspective, and it's actually a really great thing for me to be able to interview people and talk to people.
And you were saying at one point as well that you felt that during an interview, for an in-depth interview, for example, that there is a real bond that's established, even if it's something that's only very transient, if it's only for the time of the interview. And that when you listen to people, that they say the most surprising things, which you're often not expecting. So I'm just wondering, what kind of sense of responsibility then do you feel for those individual stories when things like that happen unexpectedly?
So you kind of, like, I'm very, very conscious of, like, I don't feel as conscious of that responsibility when I'm doing an interview like this, say, with somebody who is kind of middle class and secure, and they know that they understand the media, and they, if I'm interviewing an actor or a politician, I kind of feel if they say something they don't mean to say, well, all bets are off. If I do it now, all bets are off. But when you're talking to somebody who is a bit more vulnerable, has a little less power in society, sometimes people, like I think I said in the book, that people don't always understand the interesting stuff about their own life. So they have a tendency to, the thing they think is really interesting isn't as interesting as they think. And then in an aside, they'll say something that represents their life in a very, very unique and very interesting way. And they're not necessarily aware of the power of that. And so you do have to, like, occasionally, if somebody is really revealing themselves, maybe in a way they're not aware of, I kind of do point out to them, do you mind me writing about this? And do you want me to use like, sometimes if it's a particularly vulnerable thing, I'll say, do you want me to use your real name or things like that? And I think it would be really unethical of me not to point those things out. And sometimes, like, because part of the power of journalism and good journalism is that it's not just that you're explaining to people something that's happening. In good features, color writing in particular, I think you're also expressing to people that the things that are happening in this piece are happening to real people with real, unique, beautiful traits about them, and you want to express all that uniqueness of the individual, and they don't always have. I mean, there's a strange, like in an ideal world, everyone would be able to tell their own story, but not everyone is in a position to tell their own story, which is where I guess journalism and kind of nonfiction writing comes in.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in those interviews and in those in-depth feature pieces that you do, sometimes where the people are anonymous, but even if you don't use their actual names, there's such a power to the individual story.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think if we look at, say, something like the marriage equality referendum, for example, for me, it was the power of so many individual stories that brought about that kind of change, because suddenly we were able to see the world from many different perspectives. So do you yourself feel that the power of the individual story is something that interests you as a process of change, if you like, rather than simply as journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of interesting line you have to walk on. I think if I became like a straightforwardly campaigning journalist, I think the problem there is that the article or the pieces I would write would automatically just be filed under he's making this argument again, you know, and people would. So I tend not to kind of, like, I would be broadly left wing, and I think the more I talk, I've got this. I think someone else said this years ago that, you know, reality has a left wing bias, you know. So, and the more I interview people, the more I think you don't even have to put any polemic with this. I think that when you see the experiences people have and the divergent experiences people have depending on what postcode they're born into, that makes it a left-wing argument. I tend not to be making a strong argument about policy other than, because I think that's for other types of writers, like Fintan O'Toole does that brilliantly, you know.
Yeah.
But I do want to represent the stories of people who aren't in a position necessarily to tell their own stories, and hopefully will be in a position to. Like if the world became a more egalitarian place, you know, increasingly there'd be less room or need for the kinds of some of the journalism I do, and I'd be happy with that. But at the moment, there are groups of people who are kind of on the margins, and their stories aren't being heard. And I'm quite, I enjoy talking to those people, and then kind of working out what the story is and kind of putting them out there. You know, when I'm not writing silly things about television, which is I do.
Well, they're hugely entertaining. There's a place for that too. I think one of the most poignant parts of the book was where you spoke about the time that you worked as a care worker.
Yeah.
And you were able again to see that from two different sides. I did my best. I didn't do enough. I'm being hard on myself. I'm letting myself off lightly, and so on. So, I mean, that was a very powerful story about an individual, a very vulnerable individual, whose care, if you like, was at the mercy of, say, shift changes or whatever. What did that do for you in terms of expanding your understanding of what caring actually means in that kind of a way when it's outside of your own family?
It had a huge effect on me, and I think like I'd been trying to write or trying to figure out a way to write about it for years, because that's now about 15, 16 years ago I did that. And I guess when I was in my 20s and I was in bands, and I was kind of textbook musician on the left, but I don't think I necessarily had it wasn't built in any kind of real world understanding. Like, when you see how I was really struck by, and I wrote about it in that piece, like, I wasn't bad at being a carer, but I wasn't particularly brilliant, but I wasn't the worst at it. And that was a good thing to know, that I could do this type of work. But the other thing was I could see people who were just brilliant at it, you know, just people who just were so able to kind of create a bond with very vulnerable people with disabilities, and where people would light up when they saw these particular carers. And I was just thinking about, it really made me think about how we kind of decide how people are going to be paid in our society, and I don't understand how it was decided that caring work wasn't skilled, because the main thing I learned is that it's very, very skilled. And we've got this kind of thing in society that, if you manage a bank or something, you deserve to be paid six figures. And if you're caring for elderly people or disabled people or children, you should be on kind of almost minimum wage. And that's one of the main things that struck me, particularly when I then, after that, I started working as a freelance journalist. And, journalism is hard work, but it's way better paid than being a carer. And it's not, being a carer is it's a much more responsible job in loads of ways. There are people whose kind of lives are literally in your hands, I think one of the reasons I think people find that essay in particular quite powerful is, in a lot of ways, it's kind of unresolved for me. Like, I felt quite ambivalent about that work, in the sense that sometimes I loved it and I got a real sense of the importance of it when I was doing it. I think I said in a lot of ways I slept better than I ever slept when I was doing that work, because you never left it going, that was work that has no purpose. It always had purpose. But I was also kind of constantly struck by the responsibility of the situation, even though there's this kind of myth or narrative out there that it's not a very responsible job. It's a hugely responsible job.
Yeah. Well, and I think if we've learned anything in the last year and a half, it's just how important all of those caring skills are at every single level, because we wouldn't be here without them. Just to move the dial a little bit, how did you survive your survival skills weekend?
So that's I did a survival skills workshop last weekend for the paper. Just the weekend we're talking. It was good. I love doing things like that, because I wrote in the book a fair bit about my dad was a military man. So and that essay I read from is kind of about the ways I didn't really match up to that military. I was always I really wanted to be in the army when I was a kid, and my dad is the type of person that you could just drop into a forest and he would somehow survive eating squirrels and stuff. And that's kind of what the survival weekend was about. I'm actually interested in doing the guy who does the survival week things. He does a really hardcore one where he takes you into the woods for 72 hours with nothing, just like a knife and some water. Which I suspect I would just curl up. I'd say after the first 12 hours, I'd curl up in a ball and die, You
never know. You might channel your father at that stage. You never know.
Yeah, it's very interesting to me. Like that essay that I read from, I thought a lot. Like, when I was writing these essays, I was thinking about things I hadn't thought about in years. And I think one of the things I really got from my dad in a really positive way was, he was very open about me. My brother's in the arts as well, and he was really open about us just doing whatever we wanted. But he was this kind of stock, very macho kind of character, and simultaneously a very loving dad who cooked and cleaned and all that stuff. And I think I got a really good, nuanced kind of sense of masculinity from that. That masculinity doesn't necessarily have to be this kind of He-Man in the woods kind of thing.
Sure.
And the way the world has changed since I was young, it never. There's a lot of stuff about the crisis of masculinity, but that stuff never fazed me, because it made total sense that we're all different and everyone gets to pick their own version of male and female.
Yes, and long live the differences.
Yeah.
You were saying at one point that you felt that writing was a kind of thinking, but sometimes you didn't know what you thought until you wrote, and yet at the same time that writing is somehow revealing. So are you working on something, maybe bringing those two themes together for the future? Are you planning on another book or another series of essays, or where is your own personal work at the moment?
So I've been working on different things. So I'm writing some fiction, which I'm trying to write short stories, or have been for ages. I wrote a script. My brother is David Freyne, is a filmmaker. So me and him are working on a script for a TV thing. And I've been enjoying doing fiction as a kind of, like, my day job is nonfiction and the essays were nonfiction. But it's you're totally embedded in this stuff all the time, but I find fiction so challenging. It's such a different it's kind of like a different bit of your brain. Like I think, so I think all the structuring, being able to write a sentence and a paragraph are the same skills, but the actual generation of material is so different because fiction obviously all comes from, it's filtered into your head, but it's all internal. You're coming up with characters, and so I want to do more fiction writing, but I'm working on more essays as well.
Okay, well that's really good to hear. What about music? I mean, you wrote a lovely piece in the book. I just put up the book here just so that the audience can be familiar with. Although I think there's probably a new edition of it out soon, isn't there?
There's a new one with a nice blue cover, but I still have the red one.
Well, you and me both. And as you can see, all the bits I marked.
Right.
So music seems to be a huge, I mean, apart from your rock star years,
Yeah.
music, singing seems to be still a really important part of your life. Can you just tell us as a final question, what importance music still has for you now that you're probably not going to be a rock star? Well, you never know, but probably not.
Like I have a much more mature relationship with it now in a lot of ways. Like I kind of view it as this thing that brings me a lot of joy that I do with my wife and some of Anna, my wife's sister-in-law, their sisters sing as well, and we do it with friends. And I kind of love, like, when I was saying that writing is a kind of thinking, I found particularly with the essays, I take a subject like singing for that essay and go, okay, this is obviously, like, music and singing is obviously something that really matters to me, but how does it matter to me? I haven't actually figured out these kind of connections, and the process of writing an essay like that was like kind of the initial essay, the first draft is just an info dump of absolutely everything I think and have ever thought about singing. And it's all disconnected and it doesn't seem to quite make sense. And then slowly, as you kind of tie the lines together and you make further drafts of it, you suddenly start realizing what you think and why this is important to you. And, as I was writing about myself and Anna and our friends, and we go to this singing weekend every year. This was the first year we couldn't go, actually, up in the north of England. And I started the essay writing about that. And there was a kind of moment when I was writing about the way it makes me feel. Like I get particularly in group singing, I get very emotional with all the voices singing together in harmony. And there's something that just happens. And I think for me with singing, particularly with other people, it's just a really simple way of connecting, and I think humans, we want to connect, but sometimes we find it hard to connect. We get in the way of just, telling someone what you feel about them or talking about this difficult thing. And I find sitting even around a kitchen table with three people and a glass of beer with a guitar and you're all singing together, there's just something in the connection that's formed there that is just really meaningful. I kind of feel like it evolved at some point the hundreds of thousands of years ago as a way of connecting people. People sang together to connect themselves together. And one of the shames of the modern era is we've split singers into professionals and audience. And that's the big thing that changed for me. When I wanted to be in a band years ago, when I was in bands, I wanted to be up on a stage. And now I don't. I want to be in a room with people I love singing with them, and that's the book, the essay and the book about singing kind of tracks that.
Yeah, you make the point actually that you think that music preceded language and the way mothers sing to children before children can even speak. So it is certainly a way of developing connections. It must be something that you've missed enormously in the last year and a half, is it?
It is. We did. There's a few people we sing with regularly, and we did it over Zoom for a while. Like you can't sing at the same time because there's a latency. There's a gap. But what we did is like one person would sing and we'd mute, everyone else would mute, and they would sing along in their own kitchen, which was better than nothing.
Absolutely, yeah.
Once things opened last summer, we had a couple of singing nights outside in like literally out down by. I live near Clontarf in Marino, so literally down by the seafront when we could meet outside. We met a couple of friends and sang outside, which was really nice. It's one thing.
Yeah, really uplifting.
Yeah.
Have you another short reading for us, Patrick, just to finish off? Would that be okay?
Absolutely. I might change my mind on what I was going to read. I might read a bit from the singing thing because we were just talking about it.
Sure.
So this is from an essay called Sing a New Song to Drive Sorrows Away, which is about my relationship to singing. And it's actually named after a folk song I learned up in the north of England from a band called the Unthanks. We recorded it actually, and it's on YouTube when I was putting the book out, me and Anna and Anna's sister Lisa. So there's a version of the song online that we sing. But anyway, I'll read a page at the beginning of this. Every winter, my wife and I go to a windswept coastal town in Northumberland to sing folk songs, guided by a famous English folk family. We've been doing this for 8 years. When we get there, we drink real ale and eat well, and learn how to sing harmonies on top of old songs about shipwrecks and selkies, and people being press-ganged to fight in foreign wars. We are, it's true, reveling in ancient misery while eating pies, but the music has a huge effect on me. When I'm singing in a large group, I can hear frail voices getting stronger, and strong voices getting gentler, and slowly I feel the edges of everyone disappearing until we have blended into one entity. It's terrifying and it's beautiful. I simultaneously feel very present and as though I might disappear. And when that happens, I feel tears in my eyes, and a crack in my voice reminds me of my own individuality for a moment. It's not just that my voice blends with the others, but it feels like myself does too, and I start to cry.
Patrick Freyne, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you this afternoon.
Thanks, Catherine. I really enjoyed that.
And thank you too to the audience, and a special thanks to Dublin UNESCO City of Literature for its support. And if you'd enjoyed this conversation, you're invited to watch more events on Irish, Spanish and Latin American literature, culture and arts on the Instituto Cervantes Dublin YouTube channel. Follow us on social media and on YouTube, and browse our events at www.dublin.cervantes.es. Thank you very much again.
RTE supporting the arts.
Supporting artists. Supporting us.